and welcome to the latest edition of the Economist Intelligence Unit Global Outlook video. My name is Agathe Demarais and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm joined today by Agnese Ortolani, who's an analyst in our Europe team based in London, and Norman McKay, a research analyst in our Latin America team based in New York. Today, we're going to discuss our outlook for Italy and Brazil in the light of the coronavirus pandemic. One word about our latest global economic forecasts. We've just made revisions to our forecast and now believe that global output is going to contract by 4.2% this year. We previously thought that global output would contract by around 2%. We have penciled in contractions in output for all G7 economies and nearly all G20 economies. Actually, only China will record growth as a major economy this year. I'm going to turn to Agnese now to discuss what the coronavirus pandemic means for growth in the Eurozone and especially Italy. So Agnese, maybe starting with a very simple question, yet very difficult to answer. What does the growth outlook or the recession outlook look like in Italy?
So we believe that the economic recession in Italy will be deeper and that the recovery will be slower than in most EU countries. This is due to a combination of factors, including the severity of the lockdown in Italy and the country's high dependence on tourism, which accounts for 13% of GDP and 15% of total employment. Additionally, the effectiveness of the government stimulus package is also questionable. For instance, Italy's complex bureaucracy means that the country has been slower than others in the delivery of fiscal support to employees and families. And moreover, support to businesses is largely challenged through the banking sector. And although banks have strengthened their balance sheets over the past years, many local credit institutions are still facing challenges. So overall, we expect real GDP to contract by 10.8% this year, after expanding by a modest 0.3% last year. And this will be the worst recession since the Second World War. In comparison, output contracted by 5.3% during the financial crisis in 2009.
And maybe talking about Italy's fiscal outlook, because obviously that's the big worry in the Eurozone, the fiscal situation in Italy, which was already poor before the coronavirus pandemic started. So what will be the impact of the government measures on Italy's fiscal outlook?
So the government has approved two major stimulus packages to support the economy during COVID. These are worth a total of 80 billion euros, or 4.5% of GDP. And this has been mainly to support households' income and businesses, but also to strengthen the healthcare sector. And the government has also approved state guarantees up to 400 billion. So as a result of these measures and of course of the recession that we expect this year, we expect the budget deficit to widen to 12% of GDP this year from 1.6% last year. And public debt is set to increase by 27 percentage points to around 162% of GDP. So we expect that the deficit will start to shrink again next year, owing essentially to a rebound in economic activity. But GDP will remain below its pre-crisis level until 2024, which will lead to a structural shortfall in tax revenues. And as a consequence, we still forecast that the deficit will remain large at around 4% of the GDP between 2022 and 2024. And the public debt will remain large throughout the forecast period at about 150% of GDP.
So 150% of GDP, that's extremely high. Do you think that there's any risk of a sovereign debt default in Italy?
So, of course, Italy's access to financing has deteriorated since the start of the pandemic, which essentially has been the reflex of fears among investors about the country's ability to service its debt. And Italy's risk premium has widened sharply at the beginning of the crisis, reaching a peak of 280 basis points in mid-March. But then the European Central Bank announcements in late March of additional stimulus, including a 750 billion euros pandemic emergency purchase program, has successfully stopped the widening in Italian credit spreads and has partially reversed the trend as well. So overall, we believe that the asset purchases from the ECB will continue to mitigate risk to financial stability, essentially shielding Italian sovereign debt from liquidity problems in the near term. Moreover, the ECB ultra-dovish monetary policy stance will also keep the government borrowing costs particularly low, which is important, given, as you said, Italy's heavy debt load. We therefore believe that our sovereign debt crisis is unlikely in the near term. And we also have to remember that most of the government bonds, around 68% of them, are held domestically. A last important point is that Italian sovereign bonds are safe assets only if the ECB and the European Stability Mechanism are willing to act as a lender of last resort. Over the medium term, this means that the support will be conditional on adherence on EU fiscal rules. So at the stance of the current government that we expect to remain in place until the end of the term in 2023 is pro-European, and its policies are aligned with EU rules. We expect the EU institutions to continue to shield the Italian government debt from a liquidity crisis.
Thanks so much, Agnese. So it's not as bad as it looks for Italy. I'm going to turn to Norman now to discuss Brazil. So Brazil has made the headlines recently, given the high death toll of coronavirus in the country. Norman, maybe a simple summary question to start with. What can you tell us about Bolsonaro's management of the crisis?
I think it's safe to say that Bolsonaro's management of the pandemic has been one of the worst in the world so far. As evident by the recent rapid rise in cases and deaths. And I think what's really symbolic of his management is that he's had two health ministers in the past couple of weeks. One of them resigned and one of them was forced out. And currently there's an army general as the interim minister of health. And this is all because of Bolsonaro's stance on the virus, that it's nothing more than a little flu, that containment measures are unnecessary, and that a lockdown is something totally unnecessary. And so what we're seeing in Brazil, because of this sort of mixed messaging, is this rapid rise in cases that is also very likely underreported, because when you look at countries that have reported thousands and thousands of cases, there's usually a higher level of testing than Brazil. Brazil really has a fraction compared to countries like the UK and Spain, Italy. And so what we're seeing as a result of this worsening health crisis is a worsening economic crisis. Bolsonaro's messaging is really diluting what local and regional governments are doing in terms of their containment response. So people are still going out, people are still living their lives, and there's a human toll to that. And this human toll will come with an economic cost. We're currently revising down our GDP forecast of a contraction of 5.5% to 7.5%. So it's really an unprecedented crisis, both in the health aspect in Brazil, but also in the economic aspect. And Bolsonaro's stance on all of this has led him to square off against state governors, congressional leaders, and even the Supreme Court, leaving him increasingly isolated and fueling political tensions that were already there.
Okay, so that's a really grim picture, I would say, for Brazil. So a short question, do you think that Bolsonaro will be impeached as a result?
So the short answer is no. It may seem like that on the surface, but there are a couple of factors that will probably lead to him staying in power for the rest of his term. And this is partly because, in the middle of a health and economic crisis, other leading political figures have probably judged that it's really a lengthy process, it's not the right time to do it. And it's also because Bolsonaro still has very strong support, around 30% of the population. So I think this popular support and the crisis at hand are really dissuading political figures from trying to go through a lengthy impeachment process. But he still is isolated, and increasingly so. And so amid his own crisis, being more isolated, he's reaching out to members of the Central, which is a group of parties in Congress that are usually known for their sort of give and take bartering. And by reaching out to him or to them, he's hoping that he can sort of have a legislative base that will be strong enough to fend off any potential impeachment proceedings.
Mm-hmm. So maybe let's dream for a minute and let's say that the pandemic is over, it's completely behind us, everything goes back to normal. Do you think that the government's economic reform agenda will return to the fore once the pandemic is over?
So I would say right now the economic reform agenda is really hanging in the balance. Bolsonaro's actions amid the pandemic have really complicated his economy minister's plans for fiscal discipline, privatization, tax reform, administrative reforms. All of this is really hanging in the balance right now. And it's very possible that because his agenda may be derailed slightly or entirely, that Paulo Guedes, the economy minister, departs or is fired even. So given that that's a possibility, it's not a certainty. At present, we still think that some economic reforms will be discussed after local elections in October, but there is a growing risk that the economic policy direction of Brazil is derailed entirely because of the economic crisis at hand, the health crisis that's still getting worse, as well as the president's own political imperatives.
Okay, so a grim picture in Brazil too. I think that there's no bright spot around the world. Thanks so much, Norman. So we're coming to the end of our Global Outlook video. Thanks very much for joining us. You can always find our latest analysis on www.eiu.com. Today, we have published a white paper on the likelihood of sovereign debt crisis around the world in the developed and developing economies. We also have analysis pieces, for instance, recent ones on Brazil's banking sector. We also have analysis on Italy's fiscal and economic situation. There's a lot. So you can find the latest analysis on our website or on our Twitter feeds, and our Twitter handles should show nicely on the screen. Thank you very much, Norman. Thank you very much, Agnese. I look forward to recording the next Global Outlook video next month. And in the meantime, have a very nice month and see you next month. Thank you very much. Goodbye.